Bon dia a tothom. És un plaer per mi i un honor poder presentar el Marc Courtney. El Marc, perquè feu-vos 4 pinzellades del Marc perquè el pugueu una mica ubicar. El Marc va estudiar a Berkeley i abans de començar amb tot el món acadèmic i en el món de la recerca va treballar molts anys en l'entorn amb nanos tutelats. Per tant, el seu interès i el seu compromís en aquest camp neix ben bé de molt a fons i amb molta base. A partir del 1992 va començar com a acadèmic a la Universitat de Wisconsin, després va estar a la Universitat de Chicago, després va estar molts anys dirigint l'Institut de Recerca Chapin Hall i actualment és professor de la Universitat de Chicago a la School of Social Service Administration. A dintre de la molta producció científica que ha fet, hi ha un estudi que destaca especialment i pel qual tothom el coneix als Estats Units i arreu del món, que és el Midwest Evaluation of the Adult Functioning of Former Foster Youth. I en aquest estudi, que un es pot preguntar per què tothom el té tant de referent, és perquè va agafar una cohort de nanos, de tots els nanos de 3 estats diferents, i els va seguir des que tenien 17 anys fins que van tenir 26. I van anar mirant què és el que estava passant amb ells, quins problemes tenien, com estaven funcionant i comparant-los amb nanos que no havien tingut l'oportunitat, uns tenien l'oportunitat de tenir serveis que els estaven acompanyant i altres no, que havien quedat totalment fora del sistema. Ell ja us dirà alguna cosa d'aquest estudi, però aquest estudi s'ha convertit en un referent per tothom. Aquest estudi no solament és un referent per tots els investigadors i per molts dels professionals, sinó que també ha estat un referent a nivell polític. I de fet, gràcies a aquest estudi, tot el que és l'extensió de la tutela s'ha extès a molts estats dels Estats Units, o sigui que va resultar ser molt convincent. En aquest sentit, el Marc ha treballat molt a prop de l'administració pública, sempre és una de les coses que vam aprendre d'ells, que s'ha de treballar conjuntament, els acadèmics, l'administració pública, els professionals, perquè si no, no avançarem o no serem efectius. I ha treballat com a consultor del govern federal, dels departaments estatals de protecció, d'entitats públiques i privades que es dediquen a la protecció a la infància. Tota aquesta activitat li ha fet valdre molts premis i molts reconeixements, com per exemple haver estat escollit membre de l'American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare o haver tingut premis de la Society for Social Work and Research, la National Association of Public Child Welfare Administration o la National Association of Social Workers. Actualment el Marc està treballant en un altre gran estudi de gran abast, similar al Midwest, però a Califòrnia, que es diu Cal Youth. I moltes gràcies, Marc, per estar aquí. Thank you very much.
That should help. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues, Laura and Fina, for coming to Chicago last year. I learned as much or more from them as they learned from me and my colleagues, I think, and also FEPA and government and you all for coming here today so we can have this conversation. As Fina mentioned, I want to start by saying I've studied many things over the last 25 years, but the transition to adulthood for young people in state care is near and dear to me, and I've studied that all along, and that comes from my experience as a practitioner in California. I grew up in California and ultimately ended up working in residential care for about 5 years. In a group home agency, we operated small homes that had up to 6 young people living in them. But at that time in California, at the age of 18, the state government in California stopped providing any kind of care or services. And so we would celebrate 18th birthdays with the young people in our homes, and they were very bittersweet affairs because on the one hand, reaching the age of 18 in the U.S. means you're an adult, you're free to join the military, but you can vote, all those kinds of things. So it's a wonderful transition. On the other hand, the government agencies that paid for our group home told us you must kick this person out, basically. So we would at once celebrate their 18th birthday and then render many of them homeless on that day. And at that time, I wasn't a whole lot older than those young people. I was in my mid-20s, and that seemed obviously wrong to me. It just, no responsible parent treated their adult child that way in the US then, nor do they do that now. And so that's what really led to this research program that Fina mentioned that I'll be talking with you about today. So I start as a practitioner, so I always love anywhere to have an opportunity to have an audience with people who are actually working with young people, because that's the thing that I miss the most since I went back to the university and became a professor. So today I'm going to describe the evolution of United States policy focused on the transition to adulthood for foster youth, and then share along the way findings from my research. I'll mention generally the findings of US research that guided that policy development. And then I'm along the way, but particularly towards the end, going to talk about the implications of that research for policy and practice. So first of all, I think any of us anywhere in the world, if we're talking about how the state provides care for children, or in this case, young adults, transition age people, we should try to understand what's the experience of young people generally in a society during that developmental period. And we know from around the world, actually, but certainly in post-industrial democracies, the demographers have pointed out that markers of the transition to adulthood, things that we think about happening when you become an adult, moving out of the parental home, finishing your education, becoming financially self-sufficient, starting your own family, having children. These things happen now several years later. It depends a bit where you live in the world, but they happen several years later, basically in post-industrial democracies, than they did, say, in the 50s, 60s. And in fact, it's quite common also for parents to provide support. So in the US, half of young people between 18 and 24 live with one or both of their parents. And actually, I think in Southern Europe, it's even higher than that. But very common for young people in the US to live with one or both of their parents, let alone with grandparents or other relatives well into their 20s. And best estimates we have suggest that young people receive on average around $40,000 US during young adulthood in direct aid from their families, let alone child care and other kinds of indirect support. So a lot of transitions are happening later, well into 20s. Young people rely on their families well into adulthood. And also, more recently, we have developmental psychologists, Jeff Arnett most notably, describing this period of time as emerging adulthood, a period where lots of young people experiment with various aspects of their identity, try to figure out what they're going to do with their lives in terms of work, family, et cetera. And then even more recently, neuroscientists have pointed out that very important parts of our brains are developing well into the mid-20s, right? So what this adds up to is an acknowledgement by political elites and common people that, in fact, the idea that somebody would be independent at the age of 18 or even the age of 21 is really absurd. And the example I like to give is if you were at a party, a cocktail party or a dinner in the US, and you were to say to other parents of young adults, well, my child just reached age 18 and we threw a party and told them, good luck, you're on your own, you would be a very unpopular person at that party. People would not find that rational at all. And yet, up until very recently, and I would still argue this is the case, there's very little social policy focused on young adulthood in the US. We have policies that end at 18. We have mental health systems, educational systems, all kinds of systems that end at 18, and then we have adult systems. And those adult systems don't acknowledge early adulthood, or emerging adulthood, whatever you want to call it, as a unique period of time. So it creates all kinds of problems, and we'll come back to that a bit later in my talk. I guess the one exception I would mention here, and President Obama, his home in Chicago is about 5 blocks from my house, and he was actually my state representative in the state governments in Illinois when I first moved to Chicago. The Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, is one place where you see an explicit acknowledgement by policy leaders that young adulthood's a different thing that we need to deal with. Because one of the things that law does is it requires health insurance companies in the U.S. to allow parents to keep their young adult children on their insurance policy up through the age of 26. So I have two daughters, they're in their early 20s. Both of them are on our health insurance, and that's a function of finally our Congress and the President recognizing, okay, this is, young adulthood is still a period where young people rely on their parents. One area where that's not true, though, is in the area of youth aging out of foster care. We've had policy focused on youth aging out of foster care, recognizing that they need help since the mid-'80s, really mid to late 80s. So I went to work in California in group care starting in 1985. And in 1986, a law called the Independent Living Initiative was passed. And it set aside $70 million a year to be allocated to the states based on how many children were in care in the state to help young people become independent by the age of 18. The language is very telling, Independent Living Initiative. And that grew out of the activism of people working with young people in care and young people themselves, drawing attention to the fact that when young people aged out of care back in the 80s, the outcomes seemed poor. There wasn't much research on that, one study in New York, but that study painted a fairly bleak picture, and the advocates and young people would come forward and speak to that. And so the U.S. Congress back in '86 set aside this money. The good news for the money is it could pay for services, so counseling, training, et cetera. The bad news is that states were forbidden from using the money for food or housing, right? So really the goal was we need to give young people skills and knowledge so that by the time they're 18, they can be on their own. And, I already mentioned to you, I thought it was kind of ridiculous that we just discharge people at 18, but I also thought it was ridiculous that the idea that we were going to prepare them to be completely independent at the age of 18 seemed like a lost cause back then, but that was what we had. At least there was a recognition that we should do something, because before 1986, basically, there was really no recognition of that. So what happens is, that's really when turn that off. That's when my research program started. So after that law passed, you see a couple of studies during the 1990s, including a study I did in Wisconsin. I was at the University of Wisconsin at the time, and it showed that young people aging out of foster care were not doing well, that these services, while well-intentioned, did not really do much to alter the trajectories of young people. Many of them were homeless, they were hungry, they got in trouble with the law. And so in 1999, Congress doubled down, if you like, on this earlier strategy and expanded it a bit. So first, our U.S. Congress doubled the amount of money to $140 million a year that was going to states for these independent living services. It allowed states to use up to 30% of that for housing and food, recognizing that, well, maybe soft services aren't quite enough. It also allowed states to extend health insurance, the health insurance program we have for low-income people, to age 21. I'll stop here just to point out, for those of you who may not know this, the U.S. is very decentralized, maybe not as decentralized as Spain, but our state governments are given enormous flexibility to operate programs. And one example would be this law, because Congress said, you can extend Medicaid, but you don't have to. And so even by 2008, actually only about 30 of the 50 U.S. states had extended Medicaid. So the fact that the federal government gives states the option to do something almost guarantees, if it's a social policy, that many states will not do it. They simply won't spend the money. This law also did something that I think is very important. I'll come back to this when I share some of my data. It created a program of education training vouchers, basically up to $5,000 a year for young people who aged out of care to go to post-secondary education. And that was available to them through age 23. The other thing the law did, I won't talk about this a lot, but it was, I think, something that was very interesting. You'll hear it when Lauer and Fina share the comparison between our countries. This law set aside 1.5% of that $140 million for rigorous evaluation of independent living programs, and I've been involved in much of that research myself, but I won't be talking about that today. Okay, so now we have a law. It spends a fair amount of money, starting in 1999, and the question for many people in the U.S. interested in this population is, how's that going? You know, we're spending more money. They can spend it on housing. They can provide health insurance. States can. How are young people doing? And the most important source of information on that question in the U.S. is the study that Fina mentioned, the Midwest Evaluation of the Adult Functioning of Former Foster Youth. It's a long name. It describes the study well, but it's too long, so we just call it the Midwest Study. And it was a partnership between my research team at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago and the state child welfare agencies in Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin. And if you're familiar with U.S. geography, you know that's sort of right in the middle of the country. It's Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois are all next to each other. Illinois is right next to Lake Michigan. And it really was an active partnership. In fact, the person who started the study was the child welfare director, the minister of child welfare for the state of Wisconsin, who I'd worked with in my earlier study. And she said, okay, we did this earlier study. How are young people doing? We want to go back and find out if the changes we made, because they made changes in policy, made any difference. And she helped me recruit the other two states. And so what we did is the states agreed that what they wanted to do was follow a group of young people who were still in care, so they were all in care at age 17. They had to have been in care for a year, and the reason for that was a lot of young people come into care in the U.S. as older adolescents at a very, very short period of time. And so we wanted to make sure these were young people if the states felt some responsibility for helping through this transition to adulthood. And the other restriction was that they had not originally been placed in care because of crime. Now, many of them, as you'll see in my talk, got involved with the juvenile justice system, but they all had entered care because they were abused or neglected by their family. And we have lots of data from this study. We have data from in-person interviews. I'm going to share some of that. But we also, because of our partnerships with government, we had lots of government administrative data. So we could use government administrative data to look at college enrollment, crime, employment, utilization of other public programs. So what did the study do? So what we basically did is we started with that group I just told you about, 17-year-olds, and we interviewed 96% of them in those three states back in 2002, 2003. And so the first lesson from my study for practitioners and for government was you can, in fact, collect information from young people in care, and you can actually follow them for a long time if you are serious about it. At that time, many folks in government say, well, we'd like to know how young people do, but you can't find them, and they don't want to talk to us, and I really just don't agree with that. I've had no problem engaging young people because our approach to young people is we want to hear your experience, and we will share that experience with government, with the public, and in the interest of making things better for young people who come after you. And we find that young people are really excited about that possibility. So we followed these young people all the way to age 26, interviewing a slightly different group each time, but always being able to find at least 4/5, over 80% of the young people we started with. And what I'm going to do is just summarize some of what we found. This gives you a sense of who these young people are. They're about half male, half female, reflecting the racial disparities in the U.S. child welfare system. The majority of these young people were people of color, African Americans, lower rate of Hispanic ethnicity than you would find if you were, say, California or Texas, but nevertheless a very diverse group racially and ethnically. And you can also see that about 2/3 of them came from Illinois. Illinois is a state with much greater population generally and a much larger child welfare population. Wisconsin has about 40% of large population, and then Iowa is a state with a fairly small population. So I'm going to show a few slides here, just giving you a sense of what we were able to learn because we had this data over this long period of time. So we weren't just looking at one point in time. We were able to see the trajectories of young people generally, and then subgroups of young people. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. What this slide shows is the percentage of young people at each age, and as you move from left to right, you're going from 17, 19, 21, 23, 26 as you go across that slide. And the left-hand set of bars there is the percentage of young people who have a high school diploma or what we call a general equivalency degree. So those are basically, you've completed your secondary education, and that's what you need to do in order to be able to go to college. And you can see that by age 21, about 4/5 of the young people had a high school diploma, but not right away, right? At 19, 2/3 had, and so 1/3 did not, and you still have about 1/5 that never achieve a high school diploma. That's significantly lower than in the general population. But then as you can look at the next set of bars there, and you can see how many of them had at least 1 year of college. Now, 1 year of college will not get you a college degree in the U.S. However, to give you a sense of the importance of higher education in the United States, 1 year of college translates to about $300,000 in earnings over the life course. So even 1 year of college is kind of a big deal for these young people to acquire that. And you can see that for these young women, you've got over 4/5 of them by age 26 have at least 1 year of college. But you can also see, if you look all the way to the right, that only about 1 in 10 of them have any kind of college degree, even a 2-year degree by the age of 26. So that's, on one hand, encouraging that they have some college, but discouraging that at age 26, only 11% have any kind of degree. In the U.S., almost 30% of young people would have a 4-year college degree by the age 26, and about half would have some kind of a 2 or 4-year degree. So it's much lower than the general population. Young men, it looks very similar. It's just a little bit worse. And across the board, you see fewer of them have a high school degree, and you see fewer of them go to college, and about half as many have a college degree at the end. This is driven largely by the involvement of young people with our criminal justice system, young men. If I just looked at young men and women who were not in jail, and they could therefore go to school, you would see almost no difference between young men and young women. So these slides show you their educational attainment, but if you, again, one of the great things about my study is I can ask, how are you doing now? What are you doing now? And you get a different picture if you look at, who's going to school. So I'm just going to point out one thing on this slide. If you look at the right side, it shows the percentage of young women enrolled in college at each of our interview waves. And you can see all the way out at age 26, 18%, almost 1 in 5 of these young women are actually in college at the age of 26. That's higher than in the general population in the U.S. The reason for that is that, I already told you, a lot of people in the U.S. would have a degree by then. So part of the story here is these young people are not achieving at the same level or rate as other young people, but to a large extent, it's because it's just taking them longer, right? You still have 1 out of 5 young women in college at age 26. Now, I view that as really important information for policymakers, because we have a policy that I told you about a minute ago where we give them up to $5,000 a year, but we stop doing that at age 23. And the reason for that is that Congress, the people in Congress, they're thinking about their own children. Well, the average young person has a 4-year degree by age 23. But these are not the average young people, right? So, and I've been saying this for a while, and I think there's actually now some discussion in terms of amending the law to allow states to use this money for several years longer. So without even increasing the funding, just let the states use these vouchers for people that are 24, 25, 26, right? And you see a similar thing for young men, but again, it's a sadder story, right? The young men are half as likely to be in college, but you still have 1 out of 10 of these young men in college at age 26. What about employment? So we asked this many different ways. We asked, are you currently employed? Have you been employed in the last year? How much have you earned, et cetera? I'm just going to share the highlights. What those columns show is the percentage of young men and young women, the young men are blue, women are red, who are employed at the time we interviewed them. And you can see it never really gets much above 50%. For the most part, young women are a bit more likely to be employed than young men. Again, if I just look at people who are not in jail, there's almost no difference. And that's much lower than the general population. And at the bottom there, you see about 72% had been employed in the last year, the last time we talked to them at age 26. And the average earnings of those who were employed was about $14,000 a year. Now, once we adjust for family size and things like that, about half of these young people any time after the age of 17 would meet our federal poverty guidelines, which is different than the rest of the world. You tend to look at median income. We have an actual poverty threshold. Half of these young people would be defined as poor. The other thing that you note here is that these young people are also subject to the business cycle, right? So you see the trajectory going up in terms of the percentage employed, and then it drops. That's 2008, right? I mean, at 23, 24, those young people encountered the same labor market as all the other young people in the world, and no big surprise, they were, that trajectory of where they were on average kind of getting more and more in the labor market really came to a halt because of the global economy. What about family formation? I'm going to draw your attention to one thing here. So we have a lot here, whether they're married, cohabiting, very little marriage, fair amount of cohabitation. But half of the young women, 56%, by age 21, that green bar, have at least one child. And that becomes really important in the policy context I'm going to share with you in the US, because right now, states can provide foster care up to age 21, and many states have chosen to do so. And so when I'm giving a talk like this in the US, I say to policymakers and practitioners, unless you're some miracle maker who can keep these people from having kids, you can expect that half of the young women who you're caring for at age 21 will already have at least one child. And so if you design an extended care, a program of extended care that doesn't really address the needs of parents, you're going to leave a huge group out. You're going to exclude a large group of young women and their children. But the other good news here is we look at, do you have resident children? And we're really looking at there is how many children are continuing to live with you. And the good news is that it's almost exactly the same if you look there. Only about 10% of the young women, depends how far you go out, have any children they're not living with. So one of the things that people commonly believe is, if you were in care and you have children, you end up abusing your children and your children go into care. And we find that for the most part, that's not true. It certainly happens at a higher rate than in the general population, but it's uncommon. Many more of these young women have children, and their children never come to the attention of the child welfare authorities. Young men are less likely to say that they've fathered children, but a third of them will say by the age of 21, yes, I fathered at least one child, but about 2/3 of those young men, so you can see about 66% of men with children have at least one non-resident child. So that means for young men, it's fairly common to father children, and most of them are actually not living with those children. So again, if you're operating, you're preparing them for independence, if you're operating care into adulthood, you're going to have a lot of young men who are getting young women pregnant, and they're not ending up living with and parenting actively those children. So that's something that we should deal with. And then lastly, criminal justice system involvement. So what this does is it shows the answers that the young women are giving us, and I'll show you the young men in a minute, to questions about, since the last time we talked to you, have you been arrested? Have you been convicted of a crime? So you've gone to court and adjudicated as having a criminal record, or have you spent at least one night in jail? And let's focus all the way on the right there. And so that's basically, in the last couple of years, have you gone to jail or not? And you can see that for young women, it ranges from about 10% to about 17%. That's much higher than in the general. That's like 10 times what you would see in the general population. But that is actually not so bad compared to the young men. Now remember, these are young men who were placed in the care of the state because of the behavior of their families, not because of any criminal behavior or behavior on their part. We tend not to place children in the child welfare system in care because of their behavior. It's because of the behavior of their parents. And you can see that anywhere from 1/3 to 2/5 of these young men are spending at least a night in jail during any 2-year period. And in fact, half of them, over half of them, will have spent at least one night in jail between when I first talked to them and when they turned 21. So, in summary, on average, the outcomes for these young people are pretty sobering across a variety of dimensions. They're doing relatively poor, much worse than their age peers on basically any outcome you could look at. Those outcomes vary by gender, with men generally faring worse than young women. But despite that sobering picture, actually a lot of young people exit the state care doing pretty well. So At this point in my talk, I say to people, now you've been looking at averages. Sort of this is like the big broad brush if you're looking at a painting, but if it's a really detailed painting, you don't want to just stop at looking at the broad brush. And so yes, on average, it's a very sad story, but I'll come back to the fact that that's misleading in many ways. Because there are subgroups of young people, some of whom are doing very well, and others of whom are doing very, very poorly on every dimension. So the first question was, how are young people doing? And I just told you, on average, they're not doing so well. So then a question for policymakers, well, what are we going to do about this? We've already passed 2 laws. We're spending $140 million a year, and we have other services, and Mark and his team go out and do this research, and it's very depressing. So what do we do differently? Well, one of the great things about the Midwest study is that it, in fact, was a very good test of what we policy researchers call a natural experiment. So we have very different policy regimes across these 3 states. So the ability of youth to remain in care past 18 at that time in the U.S., for the most part, didn't vary, except for a few exceptions. The state of Illinois, state of New York, the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., they had long had policies for a variety of reasons, but they long had policies that allowed young people to remain in care to age 21. If you go back far enough in U.S. history, the age of majority was age 21. So welfare policy actually treated people as children until they were 21. But when we lowered the voting age to 18, most states follow that policy, but some of these states still have, care to 21. Illinois was one of those jurisdictions. But Iowa and Wisconsin discharged young people at 18. When I moved to Wisconsin at the university and started working there, it was very familiar to me. It was just like California. They basically kicked young people out of care at 18. Now, the net result of that was a huge difference in the experiences of care between the young people in my study in Illinois and the young people in the other 2 states. So this shows you, moving from left to right, the percentage of young people exiting care at different ages. And so the left 2 columns are Wisconsin and Iowa, and you can see they're very similar. And the basic story in Wisconsin and Iowa is pretty much everybody has exited care before their 19th birthday. You see a little yellow column there at 19. That's because 4 kids, not very many kids in Iowa in my study, I think 5 of them were able to stay in care a couple weeks past their 19th birthday because they were finishing their high school degree and the state would have let them do that. But the other thing you note is if you look at Illinois, the pale blue column, more than half of the young people I started with in my study at age 17 exited care on their 21st birthday. So radically different policies. And the net result is if you were a 17-year-old in Illinois, you were going to be in care past your 18th birthday 2 years longer than the young people on average in Iowa and Wisconsin. So as a policy researcher, I love that. It's a huge difference. Let's see what the impact of that is. What's the results of that difference. So I'm going to summarize what we found over several years of analyzing a variety of outcomes, and we've done these now out to age 26. But even by age 21, the story was so compelling that it ultimately influenced U.S. social policy in a major way. So we found that allowing foster youth to remain in care at 21 was associated with a significant increase in the likelihood of obtaining post-secondary education. So young people who offered this opportunity to stay in care were twice as likely to go to college, twice as likely to complete at least a year of college, and I already told you a year of college is worth about $300,000 over your life course. So huge impact on post-secondary education. Increased earnings, and the mechanism by which it increased earnings was that education. So if you look at young people in Illinois at 19, they're actually less likely to be working than the young people in Iowa and Wisconsin because they're in school. But then if you look at their earnings out of 23 or 26, they're earning significantly more. In fact, every additional year of care was associated with an increase in earnings of about 17% at age 23 and age 26. So think about that. Because you were in a state that allowed you to stay in care, you got a 17% raise for every year that you stayed in care. So that's a lot. Delayed pregnancy, young women were 40% less likely to become pregnant between 17 and 19 if they remained in care. We see reduced crime, particularly among females. And we also see a delay of homelessness and a reduction in overall length of homelessness associated with extended care. And then the other thing that we just found fairly recently was that, remember I said a lot of these young men have children, but they're not involved with their children? Well, it turned out that the young men who remain in care were significantly more likely to be involved with their children, even if they weren't living with their children. And our hypothesis, we don't know for sure, but our hypothesis for that is that one of the things we know from studying low-income families in the U.S. is, in single moms, is that quite often what happens is these young people have a child, the father is involved initially, but then the young woman, you know, doesn't want the father around. So it's problems basically between the young man and young woman, and quite often between the young man and the young woman's family. And so we believe that what happens when these young people are in care is that young men get help managing those relationships. They're not managing those relationships on their own. And then lastly, allowing young people to remain in care, big surprise, is associated with the receipt of lots of these independent living services. So if you remember, the U.S. has $140 million a year we're spending on services, soft services, and I can tell you that in the states that don't extend foster care, nobody's getting those services after the age of 18. But in Illinois, they continue to get that kind of support, in addition to housing and food and social work services. So that policy contributed directly. I testified before the U.S. Congress, and I have a nice letter from the staff person of the committee in Congress that deals with this legislation saying, without your study, we could have not passed this law. Part of this law that passed in 2008 extended foster care funding at state option to age 21. So prior to this law change, the federal government in the U.S. only paid states for foster care up to age 18. Now the federal government will continue to pay states a share of the cost, big share, up to 75%, from 50 to 75% of the cost of out-of-home care up to age 21. If the young person in care is doing a variety of things, one or more of these things that they need to do to remain eligible. So they either need to be going to school, finishing high school, going to post-secondary school, working, involved in some kind of job training program, or have a medical condition, essentially a functional limitation or disability, that keeps them from working or going to school. And, I view that as developmentally appropriate policy, right? I mean, the reality is parents will help their young children, but if the young children just said, I'm just going to do nothing, lay around on the couch all day and you're going to feed me and I'm going to do nothing, most parents would say, you need to go do something. So that's essentially what the state has done in the U.S. is like, we'll continue to care for you as long as you're making an effort to do the kinds of things that you need to do. And if you have a problem, and if you have a serious mental health problem or other disability, then fair enough, we're going to continue to care for you anyway. The law also continues all that other funding I mentioned, the $140 million, the education vouchers, et cetera. But this is at state option. So this means, and I already said to you, the states don't all take this up. So at this point, we have 50 states. We have the federal territories, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia. Interestingly enough, all the federal territories have care to 21. Federal territories have had care to 21 all along. The only place in the U.S. you were for sure going to get care to 21 20 years ago was Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, Guam. That's still the case, but there are only 22 U.S. states that have taken up this option. So that means the other 28 still kick young people out at the age of 18. So, all right, so at the policy level, we've said, okay, they weren't doing well, let's extend care to 21. But that begs an important question. How do you provide foster care to young adults? Is it the same as providing foster care to minors? And the answer is absolutely not. So I'm going to share a little bit about that. But it is really a wake-up call, if you like, for the states that have extended foster care to 21, because they're suddenly confronted with how different it is to provide care to young adults than it was to provide care to minors. So the first thing I think that one needs to do, understand, actually any kind of service. We talk about foster care for little kids, for high school age kids, is really understand the heterogeneity or the variety, the diversity within those populations and how their needs cluster together, right? Obviously, as practitioners, we hopefully deal with each individual as an individual. But as program developers and policy managers, we want to think about groups of folks who have needs that we need to mobilize resources for. And because of, the richness of this Midwest study data, we talked for an hour and a half, these young people, about everything: mental health, their social connections, services they were getting, et cetera. We know a lot about them, and we know how they're changing over time. So what we've done a couple of times, I'm going to focus on the bottom half of this slide, is we tried to understand how these young people group together. Do they group together in ways that are meaningful, that can help guide policy and practice? And the answer is yes, they do. And what we did at age 23 is we looked at those transition markers that demographers look at, or developmentalists look at, that we look at during the transition to adulthood. So living arrangement. Are the young people living on their own? Are they living with other young people, with family friends? Or are they unstably housed, homeless, institutionalized, right? Where are they educationally? Have they at least got a secondary degree? Are they in college? Or do they have neither of those, right? Are they employed? Do they have children? If they have children, are they living with those children? Or have they already been separated from those children? And lastly, although demographers in the US typically don't look at this for everybody, what's their involvement with the criminal justice system? And we looked at whether they'd been convicted of a crime, because having a criminal record in the US, even if you're not in jail, is a serious problem. It can make you ineligible for government assistance, ineligible for financial or educational assistance. So we did some fancy statistics called a latent class analysis to see if young people emerged in groups from, based on those things, and the answer was yes, they did. So this is a paper that's it's available. There's a peer-reviewed version of this, but there's also, most of the stuff I'm sharing, by the way, is available on the Chapin Hall website for free in PDF format in reports. So it's readily available to the public. So basically what we found is 4 groups, and I'll describe them briefly to you. And what I'd like to start with is to point out that those averages I shared with you before that were really kind of depressing and how the young people were doing are very misleading in some ways. Because the two of the largest groups we found we call them accelerated adults and emerging adults. So the accelerated adults, they're over 1/3 of these young people. And so what characterized those accelerated adults? So all of them had graduated from high school. So when I said only about 80%, 2/3, all of these young people, and half of them had gone to college. About half of them had children. They were all living with those children. They were very few non-resident children. Very little involvement with the criminal justice system. Pretty good mental health, low levels of depression, et cetera. They were basically doing fine. Now, they weren't, their average income wasn't great. Some of them were still poor. So I would say, basically, they had to grow up quickly. In fact, we asked a series of questions back, throughout the study, a series of questions like, I feel like I've had to grow up faster than other young people. I feel like I have to make decisions that other young people don't have to make. This group was more likely than the other 3 groups on average to say yes to those questions. I feel like I had to really grow up quickly, but they've done a pretty good job of it. And I think for them, the kinds of supports they need are not intensive therapeutic support, such as probably a little help with childcare, help moving forward with their education, employment. The other group I want to draw attention to, it's 1/5 of the young people is emerging adults. And we call them that because they look very much like Jeff Arnett's emerging adult group. But many of them are living with family, with friends. They look a lot like my daughters, right? They've done well educationally. All of them have high school. Over half of them have gone to college. Some of them have children, but some of those children are living with family. They haven't been taken away. They're sort of figuring out what they're going to do with their life. They've stayed out of trouble, not much involvement with the criminal justice system, good mental health, good health. They look like middle-class kids in the U.S. for the most part. So if you add those 2 groups together, you have over half the young people aging out in my study who are actually doing pretty well. And they certainly need support, the kinds of support that other young people get, but nothing particularly intensive, I think. The other 2 groups, though, are cause for a very different kind of concern, right? So the second largest group, it's kind of hard to see here, but it's basically 1/4 of the young people we called struggling parents. Over 70% of them are female. Only 30% of them have a high school diploma or a GED. So 70% of them don't even have any kind of secondary credential. 70% of them are relying on some kind of need-based public assistance. Very high rates of economic hardship, things like homelessness, food insecurity, high rates of depression. These are they're young people, primarily young women who had children early, and that fact has dominated their existence since then, through into their late 20s. And while they still have custody, very few of them had lost custody of their children. It's hard to imagine in the US context, particularly with limitations on our welfare programs, how that would continue to be the case. I think if I went and found those young people now, a lot of those children would be living elsewhere. And then the last group we call trouble and troubling. 80% of them are young men. All of them have involvement with the criminal justice system. Most of them are either institutionalized or unstably housed, homeless, high rates of mental health problems, et cetera. And we ask a series of questions at 17 and at 19 about how prepared young people felt across a range of dimensions, you know, to be on your own, basically employment, education, finding housing, taking care of yourself. Those young men at 17 were acutely aware of the fact that they were not ready to be on their own. They were the group most likely to say, I'm not prepared to be on my own, please don't kick me out of care. And we did that anyway, and you can go forward several years and you can see the outcome of that. So that's I think, upsetting, but on the other hand, it provides some pretty clear implications for public policy and for practice, right? A large group of young people in the US context who age out of care actually are doing okay. We don't need to feel like they're in crisis. We shouldn't treat them that way. We should support them in their education. If they have children, we should make it easy for them to support those children so they can continue their education. And of course, we should offer mental and behavioral health services, but not many of them would take advantage of it, nor do they need it. We have a group of young parents, primarily women, who have children early on. If we don't embrace them and have programs that are inclusive of these young parents, they're going to be suffering badly in poverty, and so will their children years later. And of course, we have this group of trouble and troubling, mainly young men, significant mental health problems. And in our country, unfortunately, when you have the significant mental health problems, because of this mismatch between youth-serving systems and adult systems, you basically have to get in trouble with the law to get mental health services. And I have colleagues who study the adult criminal justice system, and they will tell you 60% of adults in our prisons have mental illness. So, you know, I think that's what we need to do. And then the last implication of this, to me, is that a wide variety of public systems have to be held accountable. There's this term that the British use called corporate parenting. Essentially what that means is it's irresponsible for us to just hold the child welfare system responsible for these young people, right? Because they're moving into adulthood. There's all kinds of adult-serving systems, employment, education, et cetera. There needs to be a close connection, relationship, alliance between the child welfare system, which has now become kind of a young adult care system in some places in the US, and these other adult-serving systems. So I'm going to conclude with some comments about my ongoing study now. So this is kind of what I'm doing now with respect to young people aging out of care. So I mentioned that 22 states have extended care. And yes, the experience of places like Illinois is helpful to understanding what they should do. But in fact, context varies a lot from state to state. Policy context does. And to be honest, the folks in Illinois would tell you they didn't operate a very good extended care program. I mean, they were sort of forced into it by the juvenile court. Starting in Chicago and ultimately the whole state, and they would not brag about their services. They would say they need to do a lot of work on their services. So really, extended care in the U.S. is a brave new world. It's uncharted territory, really, for child welfare agencies. And, you know, developmentally appropriate care for young adults is going to look in many ways different than it does for minors. So I'll give you a few examples. Youth involvement in decision-making. Now, I'm sure practitioners in the room say, you know, and hopefully you do, that we involve young people in decision-making. We certainly do that in the U.S. In fact, the motto of the young people who advocate for change in the U.S. is nothing about us without us. And we really, at this point, you wouldn't have any meeting, frankly, about young transition-age youth without having transition-age youth part of that discussion, right? But at an individual level, they're adults now. And if we continue to treat them like children, they will opt out of our system for that reason alone. No adult wants to be treated as a child, right? And in fact, legally, they have rights that they didn't have when they were minors. So in the US courts, and the courts oversee our child welfare system, all young people in the US now have a right to an attorney when they're and when they're children, that attorney's job is to represent the best interest of the child. That's the standard. So the attorney gets to know the young person, knows their care experience, et cetera, goes to the judge every 6 months, we have to go to court, and says to the judge, this is what this young person needs. And then there's an attorney for the state, maybe an attorney for the parents, if the parent's still trying to get the child back. The minute that young person becomes 18 in the US, that attorney's job now is to represent the expressed interest of that adult. If the attorney went to court and said, this is what this person needs, and it actually wasn't what that young person had told them to say, that attorney could go to jail for malpractice, because your job is to represent your client, right? If I hire an attorney and I show up at court and they start saying things that I don't agree with, I would ask the judge to throw the attorney in jail, and the judge would do that. So that's different. It's totally different. Even the attorneys that are used to representing children suddenly find themselves representing adults, right? You have these adult systems that you need to negotiate. And social workers in the US have no experience with those adult systems. They're dealing with child systems, children's mental health system, high school, not college. Many of them went to college, but they don't necessarily know how to counsel someone and support them in college, right? So very, very different set of needs for young adults in care. And then the last thing is case management. I think you've moved in that direction here. In the US, the social workers, the folks who supervise the care of minors, they'll have, say, 20 children on their caseload. But the children will range in age from infants up to young adults. Well, at any point in time, they might have 1 or 2 young adults in their caseload. So how are they going to become experts in the needs of young adults? But in addition, for minors, they're supervising the care of somebody who has an adult there all the time. So if you're in foster care as a minor in the US, you're living in a foster home. There's a parent. The social worker talks to the parent, right? If you're in residential care, there's residential care counselors. You know, I did that. You're going to see in a moment, in extended care, half the young people are living without an adult there supervising them. So the social work task is fundamentally different. If you think you're going to visit a young person once a month and provide adequate care, good luck with that. It's just not going to work very well. So these systems are having to adapt very quickly. So I'm studying extended care in California. Why is that important? Well, first of all, I grew up in California. I mean, that's the care system I started in. So it's very exciting for me to be able to return with a very different policy context. Now California is providing care to 21, and I can see people I knew 25 years ago struggling with that. But it's also important because California has the largest foster care population in the United States. The county of Los Angeles has more foster children than I believe any other state outside of California. If not, is that right, Fred? Isn't it? Yeah, I think so. I think Los Angeles County has as many or more children in care as any other U.S. state. And there are many other counties in California, 58 counties in California, right? So California has 70,000 or 80,000. It's a huge foster care population. It also has this partnership, and I want to talk about that because I think it's relevant perhaps to the work you're trying to do here. My project is a project of something called the California Child Welfare Co-Investment Partnership. And that is a coalition of the state child welfare agency, the Association of County Child Welfare Agencies, because those 58 counties actually deliver services. They would be like autonomous communities, 58 of them, basic policy framework, but they deliver the services. The state does not deliver services directly. The Judicial Council of California, so that's the Association of Juvenile Court Judges, because I just told you the courts oversee our system. And then a group of funders, private philanthropy. And the private philanthropy is what funds my study. So what I get from the state and the counties is really active engagement from the practice and policy community. You'll see I get data from them. They help me find young people. They help me find caseworkers to do data collection from. And then the funding comes from the private, not-for-profit sector. We also partner with the not-for-profit agencies. There's something called the California Alliance, Child Family Services, and we partner with them as well. So Cal Youth, California Youth Transitions to Adulthood Study, I already mentioned it's a partnership of those things. And basically, we're evaluating California's Fostering Connections to Success Act. That 2008 law at the national level was called that. California is implementing their version of that for young adults. And the study methods involve collection of data from young people at 17, 19, 21, very much like the Midwest study. Much more extensive collection of data from social workers, from the people, practitioners actually supervising the care of these young people. And the questions in our study are, what, if any, is the influence of extended care? So California passed this law, and Governor Schwarzenegger, some of you probably know who he is. I can't do an imitation of his voice. I wish I could. It's pretty funny. Arnold. You know, when he signed that law, he referenced my earlier studies, because we did a benefit cost analysis of extended care. He said the researchers at the University of Chicago say for every dollar we spend on this, we're gonna reap $2.50 of benefits. But you know, California wants to now evaluate their own. They take our word for it to pass the law, but they want to make sure that it actually has a positive impact. So we're going to see, does it have an impact? If it has an impact, what are the mechanisms by which it has that impact? Do we see benefits for young people just because we feed them and give them a home? Or are the other services that we provide, you know, are they playing a role in these outcomes? And then in particular, what about the living arrangements young people live in? Because we're acutely aware of the fact that young people move into living on their own as young adults in ways that they were not able to do when they were minors in care. And those settings really ought to be part of the mechanism by which this law makes a difference. So very quickly, we have two major forms of data collection at this point. One, and I'm going to share this mainly to say this is something maybe you could do and give you a sense of what you get by doing this. So we have a caseworker survey that asks the caseworkers sort of about two kinds of information. What's the availability, what's it like in the county you work in? Los Angeles County, you know, San Francisco County. What's it like in terms of the context of employment, the other systems you have to work with, and the service availability? What's that look like? And then secondly, here's a young person on your caseload who's a transition age youth. What are their needs? Are their needs being met, et cetera? And we've done two of these surveys now, and we've done them statewide, and we stratify the sample to make sure we get, you know, some caseworkers, as many counties as possible, so we can say something about each county, and then we can say something about those individual youth. And we've gotten a 95% response rate from caseworkers around the state, both times. So one lesson here that people didn't think was going to happen is that you can actually collect data from child welfare workers. We did this via the web. It was a web-based survey. We worked with the state, so we knew who the workers were. We knew that they had a young person who was 18 in the first survey. In the second survey, we actually got data directly from the caseworkers who were supervising the young people in our studies. The young people still in care, we got data from those caseworkers. And you can learn a lot of things. So this is very quickly, just to give you a sense, this is answers to the question of availability of trainings and services in your county. This is back in 2013. And moving from left to right, it basically, the top two columns are, you know, 4 and 5, basically with 5 being a wide range of services. And you can see that the workers say, well, there's a lot of help for education, secondary education, post-secondary education. But then if you get out to addressing safety concerns, interpersonal relationships, pregnancy prevention, not as much. So they're more concerned about availability of services there. This is the most striking finding, really, of the study when we talk to caseworkers, is their abject terror and fear over finding appropriate living arrangements for young adults. Because the minute they implemented this law, the social workers were suddenly confronted with what the housing situation looks like for young adults in California. And the left there, that's a question, what's the availability of housing for young people in your county, like the young people you're trying to serve? And you can see that half of them said there's no availability or little availability. And then when you get to the appropriateness of what is available, you've got about a third of them saying that even what's available is mostly not appropriate or only slightly appropriate. So they're very concerned about finding safe, appropriate living arrangements for young people. And this is really true in the big urban areas. San Francisco, my daughter lives in Oakland now, $1,000 a month to share a room. It's crazy expensive. And these young people can't be expected to live on their own. They're going to have to find other people to live with, so then they got to manage those relationships. So it's very different than providing care to minors. We asked them about collaboration with other systems, and it's pretty interesting here. If you look at the left there, the top two columns are, you know, completely satisfied or mostly satisfied with these other systems, and the level of dissatisfaction is highest in housing. and substance abuse treatment. So, there are things they're really concerned about, and not surprising, housing is one of them. And then we asked, what are the biggest challenges to implementing this policy? We asked this in 2013. We asked it again in 2015. Hasn't changed much. That, 80% of these workers answer 4 or 5. That's, great challenge, basically, in terms of finding placement or living arrangement options. And then the second 2/3 of them say there's not enough services. So even though California flipped the switch in this policy and woohoo, we're going to let young people stay in care till 21, they're still figuring out how to do that. They don't have the services they need, and they'll admit that if you ask them. The youth survey. The youth survey, we spent an hour and a half talking to these young people. We use a computerized survey instrument, and if sensitive questions about crime, sexual, behavior, things like that, we hand them the computer. They put headphones on. If they don't read, that's fine, because it'll read the question to them, and then they just push buttons. Again, you've already seen we have very, very good success. You'll see in a minute for this study, 95% of them agreed to this study. And it asks about everything: functioning, services, social support, 15 minutes, social network analysis, who's in your social network, how are they helpful, are they harmful? And I'll just share a little bit of what we found. So the young people are very similar to the Midwest study. They're about 17 years old on average. They had to be in care at least 6 months. To California's credit, they said, they've been with us 6 months. We're going to take some responsibility for helping them on the way. And then we stratify the sample. It's not just a random sample statewide. If it was, half the kids would come from Los Angeles County, and we'd have way more there than we need and fewer in smaller counties. But it is representative of the state. And we've already collected 2 waves of data from these young people. So once again, back in 2013, we were able to interview 95% of those young people who fit the criteria I just described. And we were able to follow up with 84% of the young people that we interviewed the first time around just this last year. And reports from these surveys, they're long reports, 100 pages long, but you can find them for free on the website. So what are the kinds of things you can find out, some of which are surprising? I don't think they're so surprising probably to practitioners, but they're surprising to politicians and the public. So this was back at 17. We asked, how close are you to a variety of people? And moving from left to right, that shows the percentage is kind of orange on the top, and then kind of red is the percentage that are very or somewhat close to various people. And you can see that 90% of these young people say they are very or somewhat close to their current caregiver. Most of that, this is if they're in foster home, kinship foster home. But even if you go to group homes, you see it's almost as high. People say that about the adults in residential care. They'll say, yeah, I'm very close or somewhat close to people in residential care. And you go all the way out and look at relatives. The part that's kind of surprising is the fact that over half the young people will say they're very or somewhat close to their mother, a little bit less father, a lot of closeness to siblings. Many people in the public don't realize that most of the young people in the U.S. who age out of care came into care in middle childhood or adolescence. So they were living at home for years. They have families. They have relationships with those families. They just have problematic relationships, many cases, with their families, and they need help negotiating those relationships once they're adults, because that's still their family. Social support. So we ask, I'm not going to belabor this, but one of the things that we hear all the time is, just if you have a relationship with one adult, that's what matters in this, transition to adulthood. If we just get that one relationship, it'll all be good for these kids. Well, first of all, we ask that question now of everybody in our, every youth in the country. It's a required question. 90% of young people in foster care in the U.S. at 17 will say they have that one person. And, I followed them to 26, and they're not all doing well, right? So you need more than one person to help you into adulthood. And you can see, actually, the median number of people these young people have that they say they can get emotional support from is 4, 3 in terms of tangible support, like, help finding a place to live, money, food, and then again, 3 for advice and guidance. But it does look like about 1/4 of the young people will say that they have, or about 1/3 of young people will say they have no one or too few people in any of those areas, right? So that's kind of important to know. Some people have lots of support, some people, some kinds of support, emotional support, but not tangible support, and then others will say, I just don't have anybody. The other thing we asked, this is back at 17, I love this one. This is the percentage of young people that say they're very prepared or prepared in things. And guess what they feel most prepared to do? Parenting, which, I'm not really sure I'm prepared to parent. I've been doing it for a long time, right? But it's interesting. We did that, and I've presented that to audiences like this, and, the practitioners always kind of laugh, and, but the second time I did that, there was a young person on the panel with me, and she said, I think the reason for that is that we come from troubled families, and we know what bad parenting is. And I remember that from working with young people, that many of them felt like, I learned a lot about how not to parent, and I'm determined to be a good parent. Now, at 19, we asked the same question, and few of them think that they're prepared to be parents. So and the ones that are parents are the ones that really don't feel prepared to be parents. But you can also see, though, that if you get way out to the right, things they're most concerned about actually are survival strategies. How do I find housing? Financial literacy. How do I manage my money? How do I get employment? Those are the things that young people by far were worried about, and for good reason. Their mental health, I'll focus on. We assessed their mental health, gold standard measure of mental health. And you find that half of the young people, somewhat more females than males, have at least the symptoms associated with one or more DSM diagnosable disorders. And suicide is way too prevalent. You got 30% of the young women say they've attempted suicide at least once in the past, and 14% of the young men. The good news is when we go forward to 19, the rate of suicide in between 17 and 19 is much lower than that. It's still troubling. And then lastly, justice system involvement. So this is at 17. Again, young people who entered care because of abuse and neglect, not because of delinquency, but you can see that 40% of them, and this doesn't vary much by gender actually in California, very different than my earlier study. The rates of involvement at that age, very similar between the young men and young women. You got 2/5 of them have been arrested, and 1/4 have been in jail at least once by the age of 17. And lastly, we ask at 17, do you want to stay in care? And you can see 2/3 of them say, yes, I want to stay in care. And we ask why. Why don't you want to stay in care? Among the third who said they don't want to leave care, it's like, I want to be on my own. I don't want to deal with social workers anymore. The reasons you might expect, right? But of those who wanted to stay in care, the primary reason they want to stay in care is it'll help them with their educational goals. That was a really important finding of our study, because a lot of skeptics on the right in the U.S., they're just lazy bums. That's why they want to stay in care. But when you ask the young people why they want to stay, the main reason they say is because I want to continue my education. Of course, all those people on the right have adult children, and they, of course, have supported their young adult children in their education. So it's kind of hard for them to say this is an unrealistic aspiration on the part of these young people. And then the other reason is that they want to continue getting help, housing. They want their basic needs to be met, which again, my daughters are very happy that my wife and I helped meet their basic needs while they were young adults. So what about moving forward to age 19? And what this shows is at age 19, the percentage that have been in care all along, they never left, that's 64%. There's another 13% who were in care when we interviewed them, but they had left. They had exited care and re-entered since 19, which is allowed in California. You can decide to leave, because a lot of young people, I'm ready to be on my own, I don't need this system. A lot of young people, I don't need my family or parents, I'm ready to be on my own, and then 6 months later, can I come back and sleep on the couch? So that's what we see. We see young people who leave and come back, and California allows that. But about 1/4 of them are not in care at the time we interviewed them at 19. Now, where are they living? What did I do here? Nope, that's not. Oh, I goofed it up. Okay. That's not the slide I wanted, so I'm going to skip that. But let me tell you what was on that slide. I fixed that slide last night to make another slide. I'll show you in a minute. But the main thing I would point out is age 19, half of the young people in our study are living essentially on their own in the community. They're not living in a foster home. They're not living in residential care or group care. They're in 2 kinds of settings that the law allows. One is called a SILP, or Supervised Independent Living Placement. And that's basically a young person, maybe with the help of their social worker, goes and finds a place they can live. The social worker has to inspect it and make sure it's safe, and that's it. And the young person is given a subsidy, about $800 a month, which I already told you that's not enough in the Bay Area, but they're given $800 a month, and they can go try to live somewhere. And that actually is enough in some rural areas, et cetera. and then they get 1 visit a month from a social worker. So the advocates are very concerned about those placements, because a lot of young people, they want to live on their own, but the policy framework in California has not caught up with what's going to be necessary to make those supervised independent living placements work, right? But that's what they are. The second setting where the young people are on their own is in something called a supported transitional housing. It's actually called transitional housing plus foster care, which is a funding mechanism in California. And it pays up, a fair amount of money, up to almost $3,000 a month, to a not-for-profit agency, which then helps the young people find a place to live, generally with other young people, and provides much more intensive support, right? Those young people would be seen at least once a week. They would, in many cases, have 24-hour ability to call a social worker. And there's a perception in California that there's not enough of those placements yet, that we need more of that because there's many more young people who need a lot of support. The rest of the young people live in their foster homes and with a relative, but half of them are living in these settings that we're still trying to sort out. Oh, well, so I'll show you graphically one outcome here. So at 19, how many youth have experienced homelessness between 17 and 19? And the good news is the young people who are in care are much less likely to experience, big surprise, we're providing housing. But the surprise to the state, and initially the state was embarrassed and the counties were embarrassed. So what do you mean 14% of the kids who are in care are homeless? That's not possible. And we try to say, well, yeah, it's possible. Like you let them go out and live in a SILP or something, and then they get evicted. Or they're living on their own and their mother comes to live with them, and their mother is selling drugs and they get arrested. And so for some period of time, they're homeless. The difference now is the state of California and the counties will find a house for that child. So this is kind of what you see across the board in terms of outcomes. So just to share a few of the outcomes that we found, differences between the young people in care and out of care. And these differences are all statistically significant differences, and they basically favor the young people in care. The young people in care are much more likely to be currently enrolled in school. They're much more likely to have already acquired a high school diploma. They're much less likely to have experienced an economic hardship. So being, kicked out of your apartment because you can't pay, having your utilities turned off, not being able to pay for housing. Food insecure basically is a federal government measure of whether you are inadequately nourished, and you can see it's higher for the young people who are out of care. Higher rates of incarceration, much higher. And also twice as likely to have actually been the victim of an attack with a weapon. So, and I'm going to conclude here with caution about these findings, because that's just the association between staying in care and these outcomes. And you can say, well, maybe the ones that are, that we're going to do well are the ones that left care. Suffice it to say that we've done a fair amount of analysis already, and that's not what explains these outcomes. I mean, we do a lot of fancy statistical analysis, and if anything, some of these effects actually get larger, the benefits of extending care. So we're on to California, Cal Youth. It wasn't just the Midwest study. Again, it looks like it is the responsible thing for the state to continue to provide care to these young adults. The question is, how do we do that better than we are right now? So with that, thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes. Yeah.
Bé, veig que encara tenim 6 minutets, o sigui que si algú vol fer alguna pregunta...
Si ha fet algun tipus de dada sobre retorns familiars a família extensa.
You'll have to tell me. He can't do it. Can you tell me what the question was?
He is asking about if you have get any data about coming back to the kinship family.
Yes. So the law allows. So one thing I should say is it's very similar here. Actually, in the U.S., I would say about a third of the children at 17 in my study were actually living with relatives. So they're in kinship foster care. That goes down a bit after they become young adults because, like a lot of young adults, they want to move out. But many young people are in constant contact with their original family. So about 60% of the young people in my study will see their mother at least once a month in person, right? and a little bit less for the father. So now it's easier for them to do that. If they live on their own, they can have the mother or father show up. The government doesn't try to prohibit that, right? So I think there's frequent contact with the family of origin. You know, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a challenge. Right?
Hi. I was wondering if you have studied the connections between resilience in this population and the participation in mentoring programs. Thank you.
Between
Resilience, connections between resilience or success with this population.
Oh, I see.
And resilience, sorry.
Oh, resilience. Ah,
Resilience,
okay, okay.
sorry
it's okay.
for that.
Your English is much better than my Catalan. So, yes, I understand the question.
And the relationship with mentors, natural mentors, or in a program of mentoring?
Right.
Thank
So I would say that I think the research with youth in care around mentoring and outcomes at this point is correlational. We do have some folks doing evaluations of mentoring programs, but it's a bit too early to say what the results are. But the research on informal mentoring in particular, sort of people in your network mentoring you, and outcomes is very positive. We've studied that with the Midwest study. We ask a question, have you had somebody in your life since you were 14 who's not a family member? And we find positive relationships between that and employment and mental health, things like that. And other people who have studied that in the US, Kim Ahrens in particular, who's a colleague of mine, finds positive relationships between those mentoring relationships and a variety of outcomes. The trick is whether we can create new mentoring relationships, that takes intervention research, or whether we can support the relationships that are already there. So that's kind of where the work is right now, is how do we support the existing relationships, make them better, and then create ones, because 1/3 of the young people in my study, they have nobody really helping them much, and so how do we create those relationships then?
Hello. I'm concerned about how to convince lawmakers, and I would like to ask you, did you translate the outcomes of your survey into economical and into maths? Because sometimes, especially right-winged, they need to have it. I'm quite sure it's cheaper to help people to provide the welfare that they need in the right moment, not to wait for jail and etc.
So yeah, the answer is yes. We published, I can't remember the name of the report, but we published a report that did a benefit cost analysis using the earlier study, the Midwest study, based on the cost of providing a year of care in Illinois, which is a lot. It was like $38,000 a year to provide care for each additional year. And we looked just at the benefits in education, because we were able to quantify those. And that was the statistic that Arnold Schwarzenegger quoted when he signed the law in California. He said it was around $2.50 of benefit to society and the young person. It's a little tricky, right? Because that's everybody. Taxpayers got back some of that in terms of earnings and taxes. But yes, $2.50 worth of benefit for every dollar spent. And we pointed out in that study that we just hadn't modified, we hadn't attached money terms to things like reduction in pregnancy between 17 and 19. We had these other benefits that economists just hadn't created shadow costs yet for, so we couldn't monetize them. But we expected the benefits at least twice what we've observed. And we did that analysis before we had the crime data. So crime's very expensive, and we now have evidence that it reduces crime, and the policymakers like to hear that. Yeah.
Una de les preocupacions que a vegades ens trobem és que a partir dels 18 anys en el nostre sistema la xarxa de salut mental no dona molts cops una resposta diferenciada, sinó que els joves passen una mica a dependre de la xarxa d'adults i sovint aquesta xarxa està com molt mancada d'una connexió, diríem, entre el ser infant i el ser adult. A França fa poc vaig poder conèixer el que seran les cases dels adolescents, que estan totes instaurades als costats dels hospitals i tenen un lligam i un vincle a nivell de xarxa molt potent. No sé com a Chicago, o almenys en el model d'allà, es vincula tot el tema de la salut mental, si hi ha recursos específics que poden generar aquest pont d'una forma diferenciada o senzillament també és compartint la xarxa per tota la població.
So I would say that in general we have the same problem, that there's a disconnect between the children's mental health system and the adult mental health system. Example I like to use is psychosis, schizophrenia onset is during this period of time, right? But a 20-year-old with schizophrenia is in a very different place in his or her life than the typical 50-year-old who's in the settings in the community where those young people get sent. So you have an onset of schizophrenia and they send you to live with a bunch of 50-year-olds that have had schizophrenia for decades, right? And it really is kind of obviously problematic. Yes, we still have that. That being said, actually Laura and Fina are going to talk about, we have a program called Thresholds, for example, that focuses specifically on transition age young people in care who have serious mental illness. So we do have some programs that are focusing on that. And more broadly at the national level, in the federal government, there's been joining together of the Substance Abuse Administration, the Mental Health Administration, the Child Welfare Administration around transition services generally. So there's a lot of thought about how do we get our healthcare systems to work together, our mental health care systems at that level, the system level, to recognize that young adulthood is a different period of time. So I think that that is a topic that's getting a fair amount of attention in the U.S. As you can imagine, it takes time to go from discussion to action and new programs. But they'll share some about programs like that in Chicago.
Tenim temps per l'última pregunta, Anna.